Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to take a spatial and chronological literary tour of Thomas Hardy's life. We're going to explore how the physical spaces he inhabited literally shaped his legendary novels. You know, Thomas Hardy is actually the only major English novelist to have also been a professional architect. And as we're going to see, this wasn't just some day job that he eventually left behind. It fundamentally altered how he saw the world, how he viewed the past, and even the very characters he brought to life on the page. We'll explore how a man born in a mud and thatch cottage eventually locked himself away in a Victorian fortress of his own design, and how that incredible journey changed English literature forever. Here is our itinerary for today's tour. We'll start with his humble rural beginnings, then look at his transition into becoming a professional architect, see how that inspired the Wessex novels, explore the design of his home, Max Gate, and finally, discuss his lasting built legacy. Let's jump right in. Section 1. A humble, rural beginning. Life at Higher Bockhampton. Tracing Hardy's journey, we've got to start back in 1840 at his birthplace in Higher Bockhampton. This was a small cottage built by his master mason great-grandfather back in 1800. Hardy was born right into a generations-old family business of builders, so he was brought into a world completely defined by physical labor, bricks and mortar, which really set the stage for a life obsessed with construction. By 1856, he started his formal architectural apprenticeship, stepping away from that intense manual labor and into the world of drafting. This momentum eventually carried him all the way to London as a Gothic draftsman in 1862, before capping off his absolutely incredible physical and social mobility by completing his own grand estate, Max Gate, in 1885. Now, to really understand Hardy, you have to understand the sensory environment of his youth. This was a world of stone floors, tiny windows, and open hearths built entirely with traditional cob and thatch. We're not talking about the sanitized, pristine heritage property a tourist might visit today. No, it was a deeply functional, ancient form of rural shelter. Hardy grew up totally exposed to the natural elements. I mean, he was living in a home that was quite literally formed from the earth of the surrounding landscape. The chalk, the clay, the straw, his earliest memories were defined by the very soil of Dorset, keeping the rain and wind at bay. Hardy actually detailed this 19th century agrarian construction process himself. He described what they called mud wall as essentially unbaked brick mixed up into this incredibly heavy sort of dough pudding. Just imagine the physical toll of that work for a second. Women were often called in to literally tread the straw with their bare feet, stomping through the heavy mud just to bind the whole mass together. He recognized that this was a deeply ancient practice, one that had gone on continuously since the days of Israel and Egypt. It grounded his childhood in a vast, sprawling history that you could quite literally feel right beneath your boots. And it was right here, surrounded by a cottage garden with roses around the door and the nearby ancient Thorncombe Woods, that his early literary masterpieces were born. This evocative cob and thatch cottage was situated right on the edge of a massive, totally uncultivated heath. The intense isolation of this spot practically forced his young imagination to wander, formulating the fictional, almost mythological landscape of what would become his famous Wessex. The tranquility, the birdsong, and the deep quiet of rural isolation, it served as the absolute perfect atmospheric incubator for a young writer finding his voice. He penned Under the Greenwood Tree, Far from the Maddening Crowd, and countless early poems here before he finally moved out at the age of 34. Moving on to Section 2, becoming a professional architect and leaving the hamlet behind. At just 16 years old, Hardy would walk 3 miles from his rural hamlet into Dorchester to begin his architectural apprenticeship. And every single day, he experienced this stark, mind-bending juxtaposition. I mean, imagine commuting across centuries every morning. He walked from a world of shepherds and plowmen, where ancient mud and thatch cottages were the norm and modern improvements were regarded as literal magic, directly into a county town filled with the Industrial Revolution. Railways, telegraphs, cast iron and glass buildings. He was living right on the fracture point of history, caught exactly between a disappearing agrarian world and the rapidly modernizing industrial age. He embarked on a rigorous path in Gothic architecture, which fundamentally altered his brain. When he was articled to John Hicks in 1856, he didn't just passively read about buildings in textbooks. No, he used a strip of lead called a Leyden tape. He would take this lead and press it with his fingers and thumbs directly into the hollows and fillets of ancient church stones, just to transfer the exact molding to his drawing board. He wasn't just learning how to build, he was learning how to observe. The pure intimacy of physically touching the layered history of these ancient stones trained his mind to look for the hidden stories embedded in physical spaces. It's an intimacy he took with him to London when working for Arthur Blomfield in 1862 and carried right back to Dorset for his church restoration work a few years later. That brings us to Section 3, Inspiring the Wessex Novels, Translating Architecture into Fiction. Owing to the incident of his being an architect's pupil, he saw rustic and borough doings in a juxtaposition peculiarly close. This quote perfectly captures the essence of his unique perspective. Seeing firsthand the clash between traditional rural life and urban modernization, that became the absolute core of his Wessex novels. His characters are constantly trapped between old agricultural traditions and the creeping Industrial Revolution. Because of his intense architectural background, Hardy didn't just see a barn or a dilapidated cottage as some passive backdrop for his stories. Actually, scratch that, it's more like he saw them as living records of human and animal life. They were testaments to the people who built them, structures that recorded the brutal passage of time, the changing of generations, and the incredibly harsh realities of rural survival. Section 4. Designing Max Gate. A Return to Dorset. His new home, Max Gate, represented immense upward social mobility. He had moved from a family of journeyman masons, living communally and totally exposed to the wild's elements, to living as a professional equal to doctors and solicitors. Designed by Hardy himself and completed in 1885, Max Gate was austere, it was sophisticated, and it was entirely separate from the uncultivated heath of his youth. But here's the incredible irony. He deliberately designed this home with high brick walls and large trees to create an impenetrable barrier of strict privacy. He was no longer a working-class apprentice. He was a highly respectable, wealthy Victorian gentleman, fiercely protecting his private sphere from the very working-class world he had grown up in. And it's a fascinating paradox, really. Enclosed behind the secure, strictly private brick walls of Max Gate, surrounded by total middle-class comfort, he wrote his most tragic masterpieces. While sitting in this wealthy home, Hardy's later writing reflected a heightened, profound consciousness of the homelessness and hardships facing the rural working class. It was here that he penned heavy, heartbreaking classics like The Mayor of Casterbridge, The Woodlanders, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and Jude the Obscure. He wrote intensely about rural depopulation, about families being evicted and wandering the countryside like birds of passage without a home. His ultimate physical security seemed to miraculously unlock a deep, painful literary empathy for those who had absolutely no domestic space to call their own. Finally, Section 5. A Lasting Built Legacy. The House as a Museum. In 1926, Leonard Woolf visited Max Gate and made a really profound observation, saying the house seemed to have been created by him, as if it were one of his poems, translated into brick, furniture, and vegetation. Hardy's architectural and literary identities were permanently intertwined. Today, as a National Trust property, Max Gate operates as part house, part museum. Visitors go there not just to examine Victorian architecture, but to try and feel the presence of the man who constructed both physical walls and towering literary monuments. The house itself is essentially read by the public like a novel. It's full of complex layers, structural revisions, and deeply embedded memories that completely transitioned from the private sphere of the author's creativity straight into a site of collective cultural memory. So all of this leaves us to wonder, how are our own built environments shaping our daily narratives? What legacies will we ultimately leave behind? Hardy showed us that buildings are never just brick, mud, or thatch. They are the active containers of our lives, recording every subtle change, every struggle, and every triumph. Thank you so much for joining me on this architectural explainer of Thomas Hardy's life. Keep looking closely at the walls around you. You never know what stories they might be inspiring.